The word asylum is defined as protection, and the word dates back to two Greek terms, asylos, which means refugee or fenced territory, and asylin, which means never to be broken, safe from violence. So the purpose of this word is protection, help, safety. And that's why the word was adopted by mental asylums when they first opened. However, most asylums quickly devolved into what we can only call as horror hospitals, and that is the reason why most of them are haunted. Today, I will be discussing the history of these haunted institutions and what historical circumstances led to the torment of so many human beings who just needed help. And then you'll truly understand why most of them are haunted. So, stick around for the whole video and you'll learn all you can about asylums and the history of psychiatric treatment. Before we begin, it's really important to point out the differences between some of the words that are tossed around for asylum. Now, you'll see a lot of paranormal investigator YouTubers who incorrectly identify a lot of locations as an asylum. Because out there, it's not just asylums. There was also sanatoriums, and there was just hospitals with a mental health ward, and there were schools, which were pretty horrible, and also laundries as well, or work homes, things like that. It's important to understand the differences between them all. Asylums are buildings that were wholly built to hold people who had mental illness. There's no other wings of them that do any other services. Sanatoriums were actually for TB patients, for the tuberculosis pandemic that occurred. A lot of asylums turned into sanatoriums, so you'll see a lot of them are both. And there's a lot of hauntings that come out of the pandemic that happened because there was a lot of unfortunate deaths during the tuberculosis pandemic. So you're going to see them sometimes combined. But then we have things like laundries or poorhouses, things like that. There's different names for them. Some of them would be like work farms. And those were sort of places where they put undesirables of society into. Whether you were just too poor, you couldn't afford to live anywhere. You might have been a woman who was outspoken. There might be different reasons. And some of those people did end up in asylums as well. It all depended on if there was a poorhouse or a laundry or a workplace, like a work farm locations in a few places. So it all kind of depends on the history of wherever you're doing your paranormal investigation. And lastly, the schools. They're very sad history. A lot of them are really like a lot of kids. It involves a lot of children. The saddest ones, if you Google it, I'm not going to get too much into it because it's pretty intense stuff. But the schools that they've been finding that were in Canada, where they took Aboriginal people, the church took them into the school to try to like shape them into Christians and take away their individuality and their background and everything. And a lot of really horrible things happened in these schools. And Canada wasn't the only one who had these schools. They're all over the world. They're very sad. And I will just say, if you do go to one of these to do some paranormal investigations, please have some respect for what happened there. They're just kids. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on it. I don't think it's appropriate for YouTube, but you can do your own research on the schools. This stuff can be confusing, and I do realize this because some of these places would take in mentally ill. It all depends on the region and what was built at the time and what support systems were in place. But if you're going to be doing paranormal investigation, make sure that you do your full research and figure out what type of institution you're actually at before you label it as just an asylum. Also, before we get into the rest of today's topic, just a reminder, this topic was chosen from the community tab over on the channel here. I put out polls and questions, every couple days just to kind of see what you guys are interested in, get your feedback on things of that nature. And so far, the last 2 episodes of Paranormal History, I've picked out from 2 polls that had a few votes on them. And, if it has like more than like a few, I think this one was like 6 votes or something for this one. And last week was like 18 votes. So I'm trying to pick out ones that a lot of people have kind of engaged and voted on. And if the topic is there, then I'll do the episode on it. If you're interested at all, go over to the community tab, go ahead and vote on things that you would like to see. But you can also leave in the comments below of any future episodes, any topics that you would like to see in a future episode. All right, let's get started on the history. Before we begin this section on the history, I just want to say I am going to be using some of the terms that were used back in each period when I talk about it. I'm in no way trying to be disrespectful. I'm more just using the terms first of all, so you can understand where the term came from. But second of all, just to kind of like explain things of how they were seen back in the day. Mental health is very important to me. A lot of stuff runs in my family. Some very severe mental disorders run in my family. So I completely have full respect for it. And it's really important that everyone does get help and that we do recognize when people need help. What I will do, since the nature of this video as well, I'll find some resources and I'll also put them below in the description of the video for anyone who's in need of any help. If anything, that I talk about today dredges up any feelings, etc., I'll post some resources below just in case. There's so much information on the history of asylums and mental illness treatments over the centuries. In this section, I'm going to touch on some key aspects of the history of asylums and mental health treatment. I want to convey the historical influences that are important to keep in mind when we're going into old asylums for paranormal investigations. So when I tried to develop the outline of this episode and the flow of how we're going to present the information, I found myself kind of hung up on some really key moments during the chronological list of what happened during asylums and, different psychiatric facilities and treatments. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to walk you through chronologically a general presentation of the history of asylums. But I'm going to be pausing at some key moments, which I will put a tile screen on and sort of highlight that it's a key moment, like a key aspect that I think is important. Because I want to discuss those in more detail, as I think they are important aspects to understanding this disturbing history. Let's get started. In ancient times, mental illness was often recorded as a displeasuring of the gods. However, as time went on, the ancient Greeks, led by medical philosopher Hippocrates, which I didn't check, but that's probably related to the Hippocratic Oath. He was around 400 BCE. Hippocrates regarded mental illness as diseases to be understood in physiology. He and his followers emphasized the following: natural causes, clinical observation, and brain pathology. The ancient Greeks were actually doing really well. They had begun recognizing mental illness as something physical and not related to spiritualism and displeasing the gods. They were treating things holistically. A healthy mind means a healthy body, or a healthy body means a healthy mind. Humankind were on track back then. We were doing pretty good. But then, of course, came Rome. And when the ancient Romans kind of took over from the ancient Greeks, they brought along with them eventually Christianity. And that set back mental illness treatment for thousands of years. So mental illness now was again being treated in a spiritual manner. This was a time when the old gods were kind of going out and the one god religion was coming in. So again, it was about displeasing gods. As Christianity took hold, as the churches took hold, then it turned into, oh, this person must be possessed by the demons. So the Dark Ages brought back in this whole spiritual aspect. They believed that people who had mental illness were either possessed by a demon or they weren't being godly enough. So they weren't doing enough to prove themselves to God. Or two other things. They were just too poor, or they were a woman because, women had it pretty rough for a long time. So back then, during medieval times, people with mental illnesses were actually referred to as lunatics. And they said that they had lunacy. Now, the word lunatic actually came from the goddess Luna, the moon. So they adopted this from pagan religions to try to sort of incorporate into the church. And that's kind of how the church took over. And maybe one day I'll do a whole video on that. They tended to adopt pagan stuff to then ease the transition of people moving into Christianity. So people who had lunacy, they believed that they were moonstruck or under the spell of a witch, and witches, worshiped the moon. Or sometimes they just decided that they were a witch. So with the way that they were sort of handling mental illness back then in medieval times, and I'm talking about like the European side, there's obviously other countries were doing different things. And in this video, we're going to kind of be sticking to European, North American. When I get into other countries, it starts getting a little intense and the water is murky, and I don't want to go down the wrong path with that. So we're going to kind of stick to this. Plus, most of the hauntings and things that you see and most of the things that you hear about with asylums and in horror movies and TV shows are all kind of relating back to this stuff, the European asylums leading into North America. However, I will point out one. In 872 AD in Cairo, there was a hospital who was actually treating people with mental illness, and they were doing it properly, holistically. The hospital was built by, and I apologize if I butcher the names, Ahmad ibn Tulun, and they named the hospital Ibn Tulun Hospital. So Europeans that were traveling through Cairo actually made note of this hospital and the way that they were treating mentally ill patients. They were doing things like music therapy, talk therapy, things like that. It was actually pretty innovative at the time. They were doing a good job taking care of their people. But the European notes, they warn of treating patients too lightly and that it was dangerous, and still back home, they should still treat them as if they're inmates because they're dangerous. Now, this carried on for some time. And also, when I say mentally ill, it also included people that had developmental disabilities, people that were born even just with like a deformity of their body, like their mind was fine, but they had a club foot or something like that. People that were poor, things like that. Like, it included everyone sort of in that pile, and they were all kind of treated as lunatics. But in the 13th century, the crown finally decided, hey, no, there's a difference between people who are mentally ill and people who were born with some kind of, congenital problem, deformity, whatever it may be. And the crown then announced that they were going to take care of, and they were going to take under their wing people that were born this way, because they're like, well, they can't help it. So we're going to take them in and we're going to protect them. But the rest of the people, the church, like whatever, can do with them as they please. So there's like little things in history where like there's a small improvement in a certain area at a certain point, and then we kind of tumble backwards again. So there's a lot of that for this kind of history in the asylums. But back in these early days, there wasn't like necessarily asylums. They more relied on families to take care of them. And if the families couldn't, then the churches did. But if the churches couldn't help, then they were pretty much just kind of like thrown in prison. So there wasn't really like necessarily an official asylum. The ones that family or the church couldn't take care of were just thrown into a prison. And that included the poor and women who spoke out too much and different things like that. Some of them were just killed too. I mean, some of them were just accused of being witches and they were killed as well. So there's that. It's a mixture of everything that kind of happened during medieval times, especially during the Middle Ages, like the Dark Era. So we're skipping ahead a lot of years because things kind of stayed a certain status quo for quite some time between the crown and the church kind of controlling the narrative and controlling the way of people's lives. This is how it was back then. So we're going to skip ahead to 1700. In Florence, Italy in 1700s, Dr. Vincenzo, again, I try with pronunciations, but I'm just doing my best. From what I understand, the pronunciation is Chiarugi. I'll put his name up on the screen. So this doctor was a proponent for changing treatment for the mentally ill. He pushed a treatment path of compassion, and he taught his staff to treat the patients like human beings. And he was very much into hygiene and good health and things like that, making sure that they weren't like living in squalor, they were clean, they were comfortable, and, really just kind of handling it how it should have been handled to begin with. However, sadly, he was pretty much the only doctor at this time who was doing this. So he was kind of ahead of his time, and unfortunately, it didn't like stick around the whole time. The late 18th and early 19th century are typically seen as decisive in the emergence of new attitudes towards the management and treatment of mentally ill. Increasingly, the emphasis really shifted, where they moved from physical restraint into a reward and punishment system. Now, physical restraints back then were metal restraints, and they're being kind of held like prisoners. So that's pretty bad. So yeah, it was nice that they let them out of the restraints, but now they included a punishment aspect to things. They were kind of treating them like you would train a dog, like they were trying to train a human being. But this human being is not right, they're ill. So you can't just treat them like an animal. So they just took them from treating them as an animal who's tied up to a chain. Instead, they treat them as an animal who they're barking orders at and punishing when they're not doing what they want. It's really not any better. However, there was one good retreat. It was a Quaker run retreat called the York Retreat. It was founded in 1796, and it functioned as the best example of how to do this. They were retraining people, re-socializing people, and re-educating them as well. And they weren't doing like heavy punishments as some other places that we'll talk about. They were very much moral based. They were the first to treat patients in a moral manner. All right, now I want to take a little look at something specific. If you remember earlier in the video, I said that I was going to pull out some key moments where I was going to talk about something a little bit more in depth. So interestingly enough, the industrial era actually created a lot of mental health issues. And these weren't just people who were just thrown in there for no reason. The hard working environments, and even nowadays, it's causing it too. But it started back then. There were even kids working, and people working 80, 100 hours like a week. And it was causing people to have mental breakdowns and burnouts. And what ended up happening is asylums ended up getting like crazy overfilled with people who actually needed help. They were actually having mental health crises. Mental health crises? I think it's crises. You can correct me in the comments. I found this fascinating, and that's why I wanted to kind of like pull this out as a key moment, because even nowadays we're having a lot of issues in our world with anxiety, depression, different things like that. And it seems to be a lot more prevalent than it was like back in ancient Greece when people were more relaxed and there wasn't this like crazy living to work. So personally, I found it very interesting from a sociological aspect that this is when things started. This is when crazy work weeks started and people were doing whatever job they could take. And I mean, it's happening now, and people are having breakdowns over it. And that's what's happening now too. So it kind of started with the industrial era. But on top of that, in the industrial era, there was a lot of coal in the air. And a lot of researchers have proposed that the coal in the air was actually causing issues, like physical issues with brains and bodies and things of that nature. And that was also leading to a lot of people ending up in asylums too. Now, due to the nature of what was going on during this time, in 1877, the first poorhouse was created. So before poorhouses were invented, people who were poor or homeless or couldn't live on their own, they were different things, like either they lived on the street or the church took them in, they went to some sort of like work program with the church, or they ended up in an asylum, or they ended up just in prison because they had no home and no way to make money, like they were struggling. So it was more prevalent during the industrial era, because this is the era when like commerce and kind of like our modern world started, right? And you see how many people are struggling in our modern world. Well, it was happening back then really in high numbers. So that's when the government started opening up poorhouses. And poorhouses is where people who are homeless or people who are having trouble working, they went to go live there. There was a lot of single moms with their children living there as well, because single moms were struggling to get a job. Like a lot of women were struggling to find work. Some also couldn't like work and raise a child, like something happened to the father or whatever it may be. So these poorhouses kind of started up, and the treatment was just god awful. It was just as bad as the asylums. There was a lot of asylums who became an asylum and a poorhouse. There was some poorhouses that were turned into asylums later, and some that became sanatoriums later. A lot of it was really just about real estate and building, and depending on the location and where they're at, you might end up in a place that, as a paranormal investigator, where it was all these things. If you want to hear about the biggest, baddest, scariest asylum in the entire world, well, keep watching. It's going to come up shortly after the next section. In this next section, we're going to talk about another key moment, and it would be women and how they were treated when it came to mental health and asylums. This key moment that I want to talk about is how women were treated across this entire time period. It even happened in the 1900s. From the 18th century to the 20th century, even a little bit before the 18th century, because during the witch craze, this kind of happened too, but let's just talk about when asylums officially were opened. So from the 18th century to the 20th century, A lot of women were institutionalized for having an opinion. If they had an opinion about politics, if they had an opinion about anything that wasn't just being a dutiful mother and wife, if they were outspoken at all, if they had postpartum depression, things like that, they were just sent to an institution. If the husband decided that he didn't like his wife anymore and he wanted to, like, have a mistress or whatever it may be, he could just institutionalize his wife. There was no checks and balances for women back then. And unfortunately, it happened a lot. And a lot of times too, there was women living with their children at these institutions. So a lot of times husbands would also get rid of the kids there. Or sometimes women were poor and their husband died or something happened. They're single mothers and they're not allowed to work and they're not allowed to have a bank account back then. So they ended up in these institutions to live because they didn't have anywhere else to live. In fact, there was even laws back then that if the wife was institutionalized, the husband would take in all her assets. So if he married rich, got a good dowry or whatever it may be, if he institutionalized his wife, he would get the assets and she would be stuck in there and she'd have no way out. Eventually in 1882, there was actually an act passed. It was the Married Women's Property Act, where it entitled women to retain their property that they had during the marriage. However, that act was just in the UK. And it wasn't just husbands. There was also fathers or brothers who would send their daughter or their sister to these institutions as well. They say this happened in between like 1850 to 1900. However, there's records of it happening in the 1900s as well. And if you go to certain countries like Ireland, I recommend, if you're interested at all, I'll try to link it too, watch Bailey Saren's video about the laundries in Ireland, and they just shut down in like 2005 or something like that. Like, a lot of places have still been doing this stuff up until very recent. And because there were some men doing this to women, other women were scared, so they would just comply and be the dutiful wife instead of actually rising up and doing something about it. When that act was passed, it gave them a little bit of power. So little bits of power over time is how we've kind of come to where we are now with women's rights. Now, up next, we're going to talk about the most horrific asylum in the world. Now, I want to talk about the biggest, baddest asylum that was created in the UK. And this asylum is the basis for like a lot of horror stuff, but it was also the basis for like a lot of future asylums that were built. A lot of people were copying them because they were like the first big one. They were like the Walmart of asylums. So this is a key moment in history, and it's the Bedlam Asylum. Originally called the Bethlehem Asylum, it took the name Bedlam Asylum, and I'll get to that. It was started in 1247. Now, this is a bit of a longer story, all right? This is going to be a bit of a bigger section. As I'm going through this, just remember the things that I'm telling you about Bedlam were happening in all the other asylums too, because people were copying what Bedlam was doing. So just keep that in mind. So Bedlam Hospital, originally called Bethlehem Royal Hospital, was an early public asylum for the mentally ill. Even though it was called hospital, it was purely just an asylum. It didn't do any other things than treat the mentally ill. More house the mentally ill. It was established by Bishop-elect of Bethlehem following a donation of personal property by the London alderman and former sheriff Simon Fitzmary. The original location was in the parish of St. Botolph's, Bishopgate's ward. Bethlehem was not intended as a hospital in the clinical sense or an institution for the insane. Its original intent was to be a center for the collection of alms to support the Crusader Church and to link England to the Holy Land. Pretty much, the church started it to support the people and the crown supported it. In the beginning, their acceptance of a patient was extremely limited because madness, they believed, should be treated at home or, with the church's help. And that was the thought back then. This is back in 1247, remember. So in the beginning, we're talking in the 1200s here. There's no official asylums yet, and the church and the crown and everyone believed that the mentally ill should be treated at home. External help was provided by the parish to the families back in those days. They would help with financial support and visiting parish nurses. So nurses that worked with the church would come and visit the family. In the event a family couldn't house the mentally ill person, the person would be boarded out to other family members, and that process would be supported by the parish financially and physically as needed. So at first, this was the more humane way of actually helping people. But there were some mentally ill patients who were just too violent and they needed to be institutionalized for the safety of others. And Bethlehem would take in those ones. So they were very selective of who they took in, but they would take in the ones that were dangerous. Pretty soon in history, at Bethlehem and other institutions, things took a turn. And the reasons for institutionalizing someone started expanding rapidly into the absurd, which also included things like the women who spoke out and things like that. This is like sort of when things started kind of tumbling out of control. So by the 14th century, Bethlehem was starting to be referred colloquially as Bedlem or Bedlam. And the word Bedlam was a word that was in everyday speech at that time, and it signified a state of madness, chaos, and the irrational nature of the world. So everyone just started referring to this place as Bedlam, and it just stuck. And that word, I believe, is still being used in UK nowadays. Like it's like a slang term that is still being used. So things were quickly devolving, like it sort of started end of the 13th into the 14th, and things were started getting deplorable. By like the 1600s, it was so bad in this place, along with any other places that were open. Things took a very scary and disturbing turn in 1728 when the Munros took over management of Bedlam. So James Munro, he became the manager of the hospital, and this is when the worst horrors began. Munro's treatment methods were just pretty much torment. He did things like ice baths, extreme amounts of laxatives, because they believed that if the devil's in you or whatever it may be, that if you expel it from your body, like you're expelling the madness. So people were given extreme amounts of laxatives every day. So not only like, you're, doing the business, but you get very dehydrated from that stuff too. So it's very dangerous. There was also, physical mistreatment and heavy confinement as well. And then embezzlement. The funds were being misappropriated. Everything came about just making themselves more money. Under the management of Munro, the worst of the worst even happened. They allowed rich people to pay to come in and look at all of the people who are mentally ill as if it was some zoo. And if they wanted to pay extra, they were allowed to physically mistreat the patients. And that is what Munro allowed at Bedlam. This is the kind of stuff that is just so scary. This is what makes Bedlam really stand out, is things like this, stories like this. Also, if you're looking at Bedlam and you're interested in doing any sort of paranormal investigation, I just want to make a quick note that Bedlam did change locations multiple times. It started off small, and remember, they were only taking like select people who were dangerous. And then as, they were taking in just anybody pretty much, it got bigger and bigger. So they had to keep moving locations. And there was also times where like the building was just not worth fixing. So they would just move to a new location. So if you're looking to investigate, there's going to be multiple locations where Bedlam was, and you're going to need to do some research to figure out which one you want to go to, or go to all of them. By 1804, the location of Bedlam building was completely falling apart and not worth fixing. This was, I don't know how many moves in, but this was not the original building. So they decided to move locations again. They had to raise some money from the community. They had to get money from the government. They had to get approvals, all that sort of stuff. So it took them a little bit of time. They ended up in their new location by 1810, which 6 years is not bad, to be honest. That's pretty fast. So by 1810, the move to the new location was complete. The new location was at St. George's Fields in Southwark, south of Thames. I don't know exactly how they like to pronounce it over there. It's like the Thames River. Now, in 1814, a big controversy came up. I mentioned briefly earlier about the Quakers starting their own asylum, and it was called like the York one. So the Quakers were actually a group of Christians. They were created out of the religious ferment of the 17th century Puritan England. Now, I know Puritan stuff gets real bad rap. However, the Quakers actually helped fix a lot of the stuff in asylums. They were the ones who did the investigation and outed what was actually happening at these places. So you could thank them for that at least. But they are also responsible for the Salem witch trials. So all right, so in 1814, the scandal came out. All of Bedlam's atrocities were publicized by Edward Wakefield, a Quaker land agent and leading advocate of the lunacy reform. Wakefield's revelations, combined with earlier reports about patient mistreatment at another asylum called the York Asylum, which is not related to the York one with the Quakers, there's two different Yorks, prompted a renewed campaign for reform and the establishment of an 1815 House of Commons Select Committee on Madhouses. So it created like a actual governing body over madhouses. So this House of Commons Select Committee, they examined the conditions under which the mentally ill were confined in county asylums, private madhouses, charitable asylums, lunatic wards of the workhouses as well. In 1930, Bedlam Hospital moved again into the suburbs of Croydon. The hospital was absorbed into the National Health Service in 1948. And for any of you North Americans, the NHS, National Health Service, is like the free healthcare, like it's the name of the healthcare system in the UK, which is current, like it's currently running. So that is the little bit of history about Bedlam, and that just gives you an example of some of the things that were going on, and it was happening in other asylums and madhouses and everything too. Now, when we think of the horrifying things that can happen in asylums, we tend to think of some of the very specific practices that went on. But did you know the majority of the things that we see in horror movies and hear about as real life horror stories, they happened actually in the 1900s. So coming up, I'm going to be going over the details of what exactly occurred in the 1900s and the scars that it left behind, which in turn are related to the hauntings and the stories that we hear about these places. If you're interested to hear about what I call the experimentation era, keep on watching. But before we get into that, I want to do a little quick summary of things that led to the reform of asylums, just to finish off our chronological history here. I'm just going to mention important thing, the tuberculosis outbreak, the pandemic that happened. It was horrendous. A lot of unfortunate deaths came out of it. A lot of just horror with the disease that people were dealing with at the time. But what ended up happening from that is a lot of patients got moved into these asylums because there happened to be beds available or whatever it may be, and they were utilizing them to sort of put the TB patients in. But also the asylums were kind of away from society. So this was in a way too segregating the sick to try to stop the spread of the disease, right? Now, with that being said, when you look into the history of this, a lot of the reforms and a lot of the atrocities that were still kind of going on, a lot of them were really outed during the time that the TB patients were there. Because before that, patients that were at these facilities or the people that were at these facilities, they had no voice. They had no one who was like sticking up for them. They had either no family who could do anything about it, or they couldn't properly explain what was happening to them depending on what they were there for, or they were like had no rights like women, so like no one was doing anything about it. But once the TB patients ended up there, these are people who had families, they had money, they had people that they were talking to and writing letters to, and this is when like some of the stuff was starting to come out because they were actually reporting things back, because these were people that weren't in these asylums because of mental illness or other reasons, which there's a huge list all the time of these crazy reasons, but they were only supposed to be there temporarily for convalescence, right? So I do believe personally that the TB patients actually played a role in helping shut down a lot of the atrocities and like getting stuff in order. But unfortunately, there was a lot of pain and suffering to make that happen. Because also the other interesting thing about the TB pandemic, and this is where, sometimes I believe things happen for a reason, right? Before medications, all they could really do were these weird ways that they were trying to treat people. Like they were just kind of like, I don't know what to do. This person is dangerous or whatever. So we're going to like tie them up in shackles. But with the TB patients there, one, they got the information out. But two, because of tuberculosis, we discovered our first antidepressant. One of the first antidepressants to demonstrate success clinically was iproniazid. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. It was a drug developed originally for the treatment of tuberculosis. In the 1950s, the scientists discovered that the extreme euphoria and hyperactivity experienced by some patients who were taking it caused the drug's inhibition of the monoamine oxidase, an enzyme in the liver and brain that normally breaks down monoamine neurotransmitters. So, okay, a lot of science words here. Pretty much this was the first MAOI. And, nowadays there's a lot of different medications and a lot of people usually end up on the SSRI. The MAOIs are usually a little bit more dangerous because they don't interact with other medications very well. But this was the first time that they actually invented something that worked for psychiatric use and patients, and it was helping people. So it's very interesting that out of the pandemic that happened and out of all of the like horror and absolute loss for so many people, it actually helped pave the way for better help with their mental health. It gave us antidepressants and helped us like understand, oh, this is what it does. Oh, let's try other ways that we can mess with these chemicals. And then they came up with SSRIs. They came up with like a bunch of stuff. Like there's a whole list. If you're interested, you can Google the history of antidepressants. This kind of helped pave the way for people to get better and to not have to be locked up in these asylums. So the tuberculosis thing was kind of started in like the 40s to the 50s. It was like really bad. I think it may have been a little bit earlier than that, but like the 40s to the 50s is when they were kind of ending up in the asylums. And this was around the time that a movement was started. And this was the de-institutionalized movement, where people were pushing for people to not have to be institutionalized. They could figure out a way to live in society and not have to be like locked up like some sort of criminal. So in the 1940s, conscientious objectors in the US assigned to psychiatric hospitals under the Civilian Public Service, they exposed the abuses throughout the care system, psychiatric care system. They pretty much went undercover. Even from 1950 to 1965-ish or 1963, psychiatric institutions were holding people with developmental disability. So like it wasn't just people who were like mentally ill, like I said. They were holding people for a lot of different reasons. A lot of the people with the developmental disabilities were really taken advantage of. They tended to actually have the worst experimentation happen on them, as many of them couldn't fight back, or they didn't know how to ask for help or to tell people what was going on with them. These people who are human beings but weren't being treated like human beings, they finally got their rights in 1963. So in 1963, President John F. Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Centers Act, and he ushered in a new age in American mental health treatment. This act specifically also said that people with developmental disabilities should be treated different ways, and some of them don't need to be institutionalized. He kind of paved the way for people who are struggling there as well, gave them a voice. So this law created federal funding that the states could use to build and maintain community mental health centers. It was only the first of several laws that encouraged the states to shift away from institutions. He also passed Medicaid in 1965, which created financial incentives for the states to prioritize community-based over institutional treatment. So pretty much the Medicaid paid out more if people were kind of not being institutionalized permanently, right? So it was a way to kind of push people with money, because that usually tends to be the best way to get things done. So in the following decades, a lot of asylums started closing down because they just weren't necessary, or a lot of them were actually getting exposed for what was going on, and they just shut down because of that too. There was a lot of lawsuits going on. However, there were still some institutions operating, and they were still treating patients inhumanely. We have to remember a lot of these places didn't shut down. There's some that didn't shut down until the 90s. There's some over in Ireland and stuff that didn't shut down until even 2000, 2002. A lot of this stuff is still pretty recent, and a lot of people tend to forget that. The 1990 Americans with Disability Act made it illegal to discriminate against people based on their disability. In the 1999 Olmstead ruling, the Supreme Court said the ADA made it illegal to segregate people with mental health conditions in inpatient institutions when they could be safely treated outside of them. These laws have motivated the states to continue to shrink or close down the psychiatric institutions that once treated hundreds and thousands of patients in the US every year. So this is 1990 and 1999. Like, this is very recent. And they pretty much had to pass those two acts on top of the one from 1963 and 1965. Like, all those needed to be passed just to give people with developmental disabilities the ability to, like, not be permanently institutionalized. We can say that, yeah, we're doing better now, but there is still stigma on mental health too. And you can see the stuff is still pretty recent. Like, we're still not quite there. We have a lot of work to do in society with this. All right, so that sort of like takes us from ancient times through the medieval times, through like all the bad times. And then we started talking about the 1900s and sort of how everything kind of ended and tie it up in a little bow in a way. But we're going to circle back to the 1900s because this is when the true horrors actually occurred. This is the stuff that you hear about, the stories that you hear about from the hauntings, the things that cause the hauntings, the things that have led people down the path to go investigate these locations, because the 1900s is what I will refer to as the experimentation century. The 1900s changed everything. It was a very different time for asylums, and it was a disturbing time for mental health research and support as well. This was the century of experimentation. And in that experimentation, a lot of patients suffered. Asylums served as the perfect experimentation lab with human subjects, not so moral or great doctors could use to find solutions to things. The majority of the terrifying practices that we associate with asylums actually didn't start until the asylums in North America were built. So patients had no rights. They had no one to object for them. They had no advocates. They couldn't do anything to save themselves. They were just guinea pigs to a lot of these doctors. A lot of things were going unchecked and unsanctioned. There was even some reports of some tuberculosis patients who were experimented on as well, which led to some of the investigations of certain asylums too, because the TB patients, they had families still that they were talking to, so they had a voice. In different asylums, there's also reports of unalivings by staff members. So staff members unalived patients. Some of them even unalived other staff members. There were some doctors who unalived nurses too. As well, there were a lot of grapes and different attacks of that nature, some of them to patients, some of them to nurses. There was still the issue of women not really having a voice. So even though these women were nurses, they were working, they're out in the working world, they were helping people. If something happened to them back then, early 1900s, they couldn't go to the police. The police didn't really do anything, and all it did was ruin their reputation. So they just had to deal with it. There's also some asylums that were rumored to be helping women before the Roe v. Wade thing was passed. They were helping women deal with that. And there was a lot of deaths happening with that too, because they're sort of like not really doctors in that sense. They were psychiatric doctors. They weren't doctors who were meant to do surgeries. So there are some locations that you might hear about that they have a lot of that was going on, and that led to a lot of, unalivings. I'm probably saying words that need to be muted out. YouTube has a lot of restrictions. I'm trying my best to kind of work around it for this. Okay, so I'm just going to go through a list of some of the things that were going on during that time, some of the treatments, and these are the ones that we hear about, like scary stuff that we kind of know about and get like over dramatized in horror and stuff. It was horrible stuff too, but I'll just go through a list of some of the things. All right, first of all, there was forced sterilization. That began in America in 1907. I won't comment on other countries, but it's not happening still in America. It's not happening in like Europe and stuff, but it is still happening in some other countries out there. You are an undesirable human because either maybe you have a developmental disability or you just have a mental illness, and they're like, oh, well, this person should be removed from the genetic pool, so we're going to sterilize them. So that started in 1907. People weren't doing that until that time in America. It's just crazy that was going on. The first lobotomy was in the United States, and it was performed in 1936. So they believed that they were doing brain surgery on people and that this was going to cure mental illness. And to be fair, the doctor who invented it and the doctors who were doing it, they honestly thought that this was helping the patient. It just left the patient in like a weird, awake, comatose kind of state. And a lot of people died from it too. Like you can't do brain surgery like this. It just doesn't work like that. I don't know if I can describe it on YouTube. I'll just describe it and throw it in there. And if we get into trouble, we'll figure it out later. So a surgeon would follow along the ridge of the nose. Some of them might drill a hole into the skull. But they usually followed along the ridge of the nose, and they went in through like the eye socket, and they used an instrument that looked like an ice pick, and it was called a leucotome. And they were doing transorbital lobotomy. So they would go in 5 centimeters, then they would move it like I think it's 20 degrees, and then go in another 5 centimeters, move it 40 degrees. And then like they were kind of like wiggling the pieces of brain around and disconnecting them and doing damage to them essentially. They would damage the brain so the person couldn't do anything. Like the person pretty much was like comatose but awake. They couldn't, most of them couldn't speak, they couldn't like walk, they couldn't do anything. So yeah, they weren't showing symptoms of their mental illness anymore because they didn't have the ability to move or speak or do anything. They thought, oh well, they're cured, look how quiet they are now, so they're cured. Yeah, no. All right, the next thing on the list was shock therapy. Now, the first one, very dangerous. They were doing insulin shock therapy, or might also be known as an insulin coma therapy. It killed a lot of patients. This is very dangerous to do. They gave people so much insulin that their blood sugar dropped, and then they went into a coma. They'd leave them in the coma for like an hour, and then they'd pull them back out. And when they pulled them back out, it apparently helped with like drug addicts and things like that, which, you know, I could see like maybe the body was resetting itself. It's incredibly dangerous. Like insulin can kill a person. I don't know. I couldn't find statistics on like their success rate or like how many people actually died from it. It's just such a dangerous thing to do to somebody. This was introduced in 1927, and it was very utilized highly during 1940 to 1950. So this was like a big treatment that was going on. Next on the list, we have ECT, and this is electroconvulsive therapy, or shock treatment is the sort of nickname that people have given it. It was invented in Italy in the 1930s. It wasn't practiced in American hospitals until the 1940s. Now, what they did with this is they essentially had like electricity and they shocked it into the brain. They put it on like the temples and they would shock you. It looks very scary. I get that. It does look very scary. And there were some doctors who were overdoing it. Like they were trying to push the limits on what people could handle. But I will say, like, because I've had someone in my family who was schizophrenic, and ECT actually helped them a lot. Like, it was helping more than the drugs. And people who are schizophrenic tend to stop taking their drugs, where ECT would help them, and they'd be good for like a couple of years or something, and then they'd have to go do it again. But like, it became harder and harder to find people who were willing to do it because it was abused so much by so many doctors that like there is a correct amount and there is a correct way to do it that does actually help specific disorders, only specific ones. But it was abused by doctors who were putting too much electricity in, and they were doing it for anyone. Like if you were depressed or had anxiety, they put you in ECT. It's not meant for that. It helps people who are like schizophrenic instead. It just got out of control, and doctors were like pushing the limits on it. So it's very frowned upon and very stigmatized now. All right, the next one on the list is hydrotherapy. And this also goes back to ice baths. Like they did this before the 1900s as well, but it got really big in the 1900s. They even did it for people who had TB. They would mummify people in like cloth, and then they'd spray them with really cold water or submerge them in an ice bath for hours at a time. It doesn't sound so bad when you're just talking about it, but you had to stay there for an extended period of time. It wasn't just like a minute or 5 minutes. Like, they made you stay for hours. It's pretty intense to be doing that to people multiple times a day. Additionally, during this time, straitjackets and restraints, they continued, but they were more jackets. They were changed to cloth and leather instead of metal restraints. But they tended, again, the doctors or the nurses would just throw that on people instead of like actually trying to work through their problems, like the slightest little thing, and then a person would get a straitjacket. It's just like all these treatments were being abused. Like, some of them are good in moderation, some of them are good for specific situations, but they were being heavily abused. And also, some of these treatments, they were being pushed to their limits because the doctors were experimenting on people so that they could get answers to bring back to have more solutions to treat people. But they were treating people as guinea pigs, which is just totally inhumane. Okay, I also just want to mention, I removed it from my notes because I didn't really know where to put it exactly, but there was sort of like a brain surgery going on, and it dated really far back. They found a bunch of skulls with it from like 6500 BC or something like that, where they would like bore holes into a person's skull to like let the demons out. And that was even happening like in the 18th century. There was also the bloodletting too as well, so that was kind of going on. These were like at-home treatments and things like that. So things like that were happening even before. The lobotomy stuff and things like that, it had sort of a beginning in these old ancient treatments, and then they tried to like make them modern. I just want to kind of like throw that in there because I'm not really sure where else to put that, because it's the only one that was like a physical surgery that took place in ancient time. Now, there were also other experiments going on. You'll hear about ones where maybe you go in for paranormal investigation to a place and they'll tell you a story about the doctor that there was rumors that he was doing some experiments. These are like rumors, they're stories, and some of them might be true and some of them just might be made up. So you want to make sure that you do your history on it. Don't discount them, because I'm going to explain to you a crazy story here right now of something that happened in Canada, and this was an experiment going on. And this one actually got outed, and there's details of it because the CIA apparently was trying to utilize the results from it. So if you hear a rumor, if you're going in for a paranormal investigation of an asylum and you hear a rumor about a doctor, look into it a little bit. It might be true. So this experiment was called the Montreal experiments. They were a series of experiments initially trying to treat schizophrenia. And what they were doing is they were changing the memories. They were erasing patients' memories. The psychiatrist that was working on it was Donald Ewan Cameron, and he's from Scotland. So his method was called, quote, psychic driving, as well as drug-induced sleep, intensive ECT therapy, sensory deprivation, and Thorazine. Thorazine is a antipsychotic medication. So these experiments were actually taking place at the McGill University between 1957 and 1964, and they were funded by the CIA as part of the Project MK Ultra, which MK Ultra, you guys probably heard about that. So MK Ultra lasted until around 1973, and it was revealed to the public in 1975. So the patients of this experiment, they expected positive changes from this treatment. However, these patients suffered immensely, and everything that happened to them was just totally inhumane, like the way that it all went down. So, and it wasn't only the patients, but their families also showed long-lasting effects on their mental health. So some of the symptoms, some of the outcomes of what happened to these patients were retrograde amnesia as well. A lot of them had impairments in their everyday life. Like, they can't even care for themselves. They can't brush their hair, like, clean themselves up after like things like that. Like, it actually messed up their minds. I think probably he probably did damage with ECT. Again, this is someone who went crazy with ECT. The other stuff that he was doing, it could have like messed with them psychologically and made the schizophrenia like even worse for sure. But I have a feeling that he was dialing up that ECT real hard, and he probably did a lot of damage to people's brains because of it. So why did I tell you that story? Well, I told you that story because you might hear lore that, there's a doctor who apparently was doing these experiments, etc., and that's why this particular asylum or hospital is haunted. And it could very well be true because this stuff was going on. There was a lot of stuff going on unchecked. There was a lot of stuff going on, just no one spoke up. People were scared to speak up, etc. So that is what makes a lot of these asylums and hospitals and like poorhouses and everything so haunted, because of all of the just despair and the terror and all the unaliving that took place in these places. All right, so up next, let's talk about hauntings in asylums. Let's sort of talk about why an asylum's haunted and the types of hauntings that might be occurring there. All right, before we get too deep into hauntings, I want to discuss a little bit about something that I saw in the Side-Eye Guy, one of his YouTube videos that I watched recently. I will link his video, but essentially what he talks about in this video is remembering and respecting what has happened in a lot of these places. A lot of very traumatic stuff happened. If you're investigating a place where it was recently shut down, like we're talking the ones in the 90s, etc., like if there's still people alive, if there's still victims alive from that place, then out of respect, maybe don't post it to YouTube. Out of respect, keep your investigation private and don't dredge up the trauma that one of these people might come across it on the internet, and it might just like bring up so much bad for them. And I never really thought about this until I saw it on Side-Eye Guy's video, and I gotta agree, like if there's people that are still alive from this location and they went through these traumatic experiences, don't turn it into entertainment fodder.
I was with Adelaide Haunted Horizons not so long ago, and we filmed 3 paranormal investigations together. At the time of this recording, I only have one of those videos uploaded to my channel, the other 2 will be out a little bit later. But anyway, during my stay in Adelaide, the ladies took me to what is now the closed down Z Ward, or Ward for the Criminally Insane, but today would probably be called something more along the lines of Ward for Criminals with Mental Health Issues. Z Ward is a protected, secure building, so it doesn't look anything like the place where Mo is at right now. But Z Ward is reported to be haunted. Adelaide Haunted Horizon took me to this asylum, but I was instructed to not take any footage inside the building with the intention of uploading to YouTube. Alison and CAG have this same policy for anyone who visits Z Ward on one of their tours, because the patients and nurses who used to work there are still alive to this day, and some of them, allegedly, may have had a pretty bad time during their stay at Z Ward. I totally agree with Alison and CAG in this decision, and I think there are a fair few YouTubers who need to be very careful about what content they put out there on YouTube that could really affect the mental health and the impact of some of the people that are alive to this day on the locations these YouTubers visit.
Let's get into the hauntings. It's enough soapbox. Let's get into the hauntings. All right, so there's a lot of theories about hauntings in asylums. And me personally, I think there's like maybe 3 different kinds, and it all depends on what you believe in. So one, there's like the residual haunting. And that's in a lot of locations, including like battlefields, where you'll just see something repeating itself. Personally, there's no direct answers, there's no like correct answer out there. People don't really know. So personally, I believe residual hauntings are just leftover energy. It's like burned into like an image, burned into an image plate back with cameras, It's like the energy was so powerful. The stuff that was happening in the area was so intense that it left behind a residual copy of the history, and it's just repeating itself like a video. And those are not, in my opinion, those are not spirits who are stuck. It's just repeating itself. It's like you can view the past. So me personally, I don't believe residual haunting is actual spirits who are stuck. I think it's just energy was so strong that it left behind a copy of the past. It's very interesting. I could probably rant and talk about it and theorize. It's sort of like an interesting topic to me, but let me know what you guys think about residual hauntings, what you think they are. Number 1 haunting asylum, definitely residual. There's a lot of residual, just like you will find in like a battlefield. Number 2 haunting would be an intelligent spirit of some sort. So this would be like a human spirit who might be stuck or, want to be there or whatever. Sometimes there's human spirits that are in these asylums that are actually caretakers. Some of them are like employees that used to work there. Some of them are like patients, but they're there trying to like take care of the place. Some of them also are lost and they can't move on. Some of them also are angry, and some of them can be mean too. So like there's different ones. But these intelligent hauntings, they'll like react to you, right? They'll respond to you, they'll react to you. You can have like a back and forth with them. And those are the intelligent hauntings. And then number 3, demonic or something else. Now this goes into like, okay, what do you believe in? Right? I am pagan myself. I don't believe in demons as they are in the Bible, but I believe that there's other beings and things out there. In fact, there's a really interesting video, and I'll try to link it. It's like Shan Clan Productions, I believe his name is. But he's an Aboriginal, and he talks about spirit eaters, and he talks about other beings and other like entities out there. And I believe some of them could be that. I do believe in demons, but I think that they're just something else, not necessarily how the Bible sees them. Possessions usually happen to people that are dealing with something, like people that are weak, mental illness, or people that are sort of at a bad point in their life or something like that. And these people can become possessed. Like you can become possessed by spirits or beings or whatever it may be if you're leaving yourself open to it. A lot of times accidentally opening yourself to it. Some of these people could also be in these asylums, but they're just possessed by something, because I believe in possessions. So like those are the 3 that I think are from asylums. That's the type of hauntings I think that you'll find there. And I'd like to hear what you guys think though. Like, what do you think? What type of hauntings are in asylums? What kind of things, stories have you heard? Those are the 3 that I think occur in anywhere like an asylum, a prison, a battlefield. I've done ghost hunting at battlefields and prisons. I haven't done an asylum yet. All right, so this video has just been really like a broad discussion about asylums and hauntings of asylums. So I didn't go into like details of a specific asylum because we'd be here forever. There's so many of them. But I'm just gonna point out a couple that I found interesting. And if there's a specific asylum that you would love to see like a full deep dive video on, like what I did with the Amityville horror video, which I'll link at the end, just leave it in the comments and let me know what location specifically that you would love to see a paranormal history video on. All right, let's start with the first one that I'm going to tell you about. This first one is the Athens Lunatic Asylum. It's the only mental hospital that's in Ohio that still looks like its original building. It opened in 1874. It underwent like 9 different name changes, and it stayed in operation until 93. So the history of this place, it tells us that there's 1,900 unidentified patients buried on the grounds of the hospital. This place was notorious for its lobotomy procedures, and a lot of people did not survive. Each headstone is only marked by a number, and there's no names. The hospital was also the location of a disappearance of a female patient in 1978. Her body was eventually discovered a year later in an abandoned section of the hospital. So, for more than 3 decades after what happened to her, the stains from her blood in the scene remained visible in the room. So that's the first place I would be interested to go and do an investigation at that location. Now, it being open until 93, if there was any sort of atrocities or terrorizing of patients, if there's any survivors of that are still alive, that's where I'd be careful to like look into it before I go posting anything to YouTube. Okay, I'm going to give you one more asylum ghost story history to end off on here. The next one is the Danvers State Hospital. It was a psychiatric hospital in Danvers, Massachusetts. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong. It was built in 1874, opened in 1878, closed down in 92 due to budget costs. So what's interesting about this one is the judge who presided over the Salem witch trials, John Hawthorne, also lived there a few hundred years ago. Soon after its openings, reports began to spill out of inhumane practices occurring in the haunted hospital. Shock therapy, lobotomies, drugs, straitjackets were commonplace. It was reminiscent of Rolling Hills Asylum and Penhurst Asylum. The cruelty here lasted even throughout the 21st century. And a lot of people say that the energy here is just really heavy and intense. A total of 270 people reportedly died at the hospital in just 1 year. Danvers is now known as the birthplace of the prefrontal lobotomy, and lobotomies left patients in a hellish daze. They were wandering the halls. What's interesting about this place is H.P. Lovecraft used Danvers as the inspiration for his Arkham Sanatorium, and the Arkham was the inspiration for Arkham Asylum in Batman's comics. Still left here as well are 2 cemeteries filled with 770 people who are buried there. People who come to the hospital report screaming, banging, and crying. And the cemeteries are also very much hotbed of paranormal activity. A lot of apparitions as well are caught here. I found those 2 very interesting stories. So that's just a couple. There's a lot more out there. Do your research. All right, so where does this leave us? The atrocities of the past still linger in some of the halls of the asylums today. The best that we can do for society now is remember the past so we don't repeat it again in the future. We've come a long way with mental health supports, but there is still stigma out there. So we as people should try to further break down that barrier and try to help people and accept that some people need help. Now, for the paranormal investigation angle of this, investigators, please do your research. Get the name and the type of the location correct. Don't call something an asylum when it's just a sanatorium or it was just a hospital. Get your information correct on these places and properly label them. I'm especially talking to people that are throwing this stuff up on YouTube. All right. Check more than one source. Go to like multiple websites and confirm and cross-reference this stuff. If there's any living survivors of the traumatic events that happen at these places, please consider not posting your video. And as paranormal investigators, those who aren't just looking for fame and fortune, they're trying to actually like either prove that spirits exist or help them move on, or both. Most people try to be respectful of the spirits, so let's also be respectful of anyone who's still living, that a video on YouTube or something that we do might cause them to relive real bad memories of their time. And if mistakes happen, and just, own up to it and apologize. So, have you been in any haunted asylums? Do you have any experience with it? Do you have any stories? If you want to see me do a deep dive like I did last week on Amityville, which I will link up here, please leave a comment below of a place that you would like me to do a deep dive. If you've enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like and to subscribe so that you'll be notified of all of our future videos. Thank you guys for stopping by and checking out this week's paranormal history.